Hey everyone, Cursed Deck Builder here, and we're making our way to 10,000 decks assisted with a Dihada Binder of Wills Reanimator deck. This deck comes to us from Lumenius, who says this is a reanimation with a side focus on Legendary Tribal. They've got a few upgrades already planned, with Akroma's Will, Teferi's Protection, Reanimate, Dance of the Dead, and Necromancy coming in. They're also trying to find room for Invasion of Fiora, but they're trying to figure out what they want to change, except for they're considering cutting Thalia from the list, which Thalia we'll find out in a second. As always, this deck list is available in the YouTube video description below. I highly recommend you take a look before we continue the video or as you watch the video so you can see for yourself what the deck is, if you have any ideas, and if you think of anything I don't, put it in the comments below because we should all work together to make this deck the strongest it can be. Or let's say the most successful it can be. So who's Dihada, Binder of Wills, and why are they in a legendary Reanimator deck? Well, Dihada, Binder of Wills is a planeswalker who can be your commander. She comes in at 4 mana in Mardu colors with 5 loyalty. Her +2 is up to one legendary creature gains vigilance, lifelink, and indestructible until end of turn, until the end of your next turn, so for a full turn cycle. And then her -3, which is really the good stuff here, is you're going to look at the top 4 cards, and you can put any number of legendary cards among them, which means you don't have to, but you can, into your hand, and the rest go into your graveyard. Create a treasure token for each card you put into your graveyard. What I find particularly cool about Dihada's -3 is that it can actually read -3, mill 4, create 4 treasure tokens. And within those colors, that's a particularly strong ability. I think, with this in mind, I think I might take a crack at Dihada sometime soon. She does fill in something that I really do like, where she's the kind of commander that is judged for what she is meant to do as opposed to what she actually does. Much like the Esper Sphinx or Vishgraz, who is my Abzan commander. If you build Dihada, it's easy to be distracted by the fact that she is very, very big into legends, and instead forget the fact that her -3 puts 4 treasure into play. That is pretty good, I would say. But let's come back to that in a bit. So, our deck is a reanimation deck. So our main goal is to find a way to put our legendary creatures into graveyard and bring them back from the dead. Let's take a look at the curve. The curve is very good. It makes sense that we're higher on the top end because we are looking for cards to reanimate and cheat into play, and therefore we have a number of cards we don't expect to actually cast, but instead to reanimate. So, what does this deck do, and where are some weak points? Well, the first thing I do like is we are playing the collection of Reanimate. We are playing Buried Alive. Entomb is also in here. We have Animate Dead, and they've talked about putting in Dance of the Dead and Necromancy, which are, if I remember correctly, Animate Dead variants that do about the same thing of returning a creature into play. The big payoff of the deck, interestingly enough, is not the legendary creature you want to reanimate, but instead Primeval's Glorious Rebirth. This is kind of this is interesting because when we play Legends in any Orzhov list and Orzhov and beyond, such as this Mardu list, Primeval's Glorious Rebirth is incredibly attractive. It's a legendary sorcery, so we need a legend, and then it returns all our legends from our graveyard to the battlefield. I sometimes have a hard time with this card as our decks get stronger, mainly because something instead like Living Death, which I will pull up now. Living Death might seem just a little better because it is also a board clear and it reanimates all of our creatures. Like the thing that makes Primeval's Glorious Rebirth good is two things. One, it brings back Planeswalkers and other legendary cards, such as Bloodlust's Citadel. And two, when you play only legendary creatures, it says bring back all of your creatures. Living Death kind of also does this. So for 2 less mana and wiping the board, I think this is pretty comparable. Um, I'm not saying to take out Primeval's Glorious Rebirth, but it's something to think about. As your deck is increasing in power, 7 mana is getting to be a lot. Also, I'd like to point out one benefit Primeval's Glorious Rebirth has, which I think this is a real benefit, is Anger stays in the graveyard, so its effect stays around. I think that's really interesting. Um, I think that mechanic is really strong. You have a pretty good chance, especially if you use something like Buried Alive or just Dig with Dihada, you have a pretty high chance of just throwing Anger into the graveyard and leaving it in there. And then if you were to cast Primeval's Glorious Rebirth, you'd be pretty happy. Uh, Noticing really quickly Farewell here, I would recommend not playing Farewell. I recognize there is kind of a vibe of Farewell being one of the strongest cards in white. I don't know to what degree I agree with that, but I will note that in a deck where you want to reanimate your creatures, a exile-based board clear probably is not where you want to be because you will lose your ability to reanimate your own creatures, and that if you just want across the board, you know, destruction, planar cleansing really is the one to do that for the same mana cost because at least you get to keep your creatures in your graveyard. Alternatively, there is the, my goodness, I'm gonna have to type this whole thing out. White, 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 black, red, and then we'll copy paste that. And hopefully that will get, I think it's Ruinous Ultimatum. Yeah, okay, just remembered it in time. Ruinous Ultimatum is pretty close. I'm not a big fan of this card, but if you're thinking about Farewell, like, and you want to use it selectively, like, you might as well pay an additional mana to do this. You do get Treasure from Dihada, which makes it easier to cast. So this would be a kind of deck that I wouldn't be too against it. But that's mainly it for here. I find both I notice you're playing all the talismans, but you're not playing all the signets. I think for you, it's very free to play all of the signets, with Orzhov signet and Boros signet being the ones missing, because you are playing a 4 mana commander, and a 4 mana commander is ideal on turn 3. 3 colors, signets and talismans are pretty valuable. So this is pretty clean. Enchantments. I want to really quick, like, briefly talk about maybe playing Necropotence. This deck has a pretty high power level, but you don't really have what I would consider consistent card draw. And so the kind of thing is that you're kind of I'm saying kind a lot. You're kind of oh my goodness, I'm trapped. You're leaning on Dihada's ability to dig very heavily. Because with Dihada, you get to dig very deeply and hopefully put your creatures into your graveyard, get the mana to cast whatever else, take a turn off to pump something or just +2, and then the turn after you're going to dig again. And though this is really good at doing entombs and creating mana, I'm going to suggest it's not great at finding your pieces, which are reanimate and the such. And though, are you playing Vampiric Tutor? You're not. Are you playing? Okay. Then I'm still going to potentially suggest Necropotence or one of the weaker ones being Phyrexian Arena, Greed, or the like, because you have to kind of naturally draw into your reanimation a lot of the time here, and I think you might be a little happier if you don't have to do that. And Necropotence seems to be at the power level that you can get away with here. On the same thought, I will point out that you can also play some tutors. Um, Profane Tutor comes to mind. I will just write here. as this looks Profane Tutor, Demonic Tutor. Demonic Tutor might be a bit pricey for the deck, but at least Profane Tutor should be nice and easy. Um, Demonic Intent, Diabolic Intent, I believe is the one I'm thinking of. Diabolic Intent is also very Profane Tutor. There you are. Is also playable, though a bit harder because you don't have as many small creatures to sacrifice. But all of this will help you get your reanimation spell, which is something that Dihada cannot grab for you. Okay, so with those in mind, let's take a peek at our creatures and what we want to reanimate. Like many other reanimation or commander decks in general, we're going to have a mix of the early stuff, which is creatures we want to play out to kind of give us value and push us into the direction we want to, and then we're going to have our reanimation targets. And something that's notable in this deck is I feel like the early stuff is mostly very strong. I think to an extent you are slightly held back by the legendary restriction, but that's understandable. We're missing some like really strong cards in the colors, such as Dark Confidant, such as Drannith Magistrate, and the like. But it makes sense that they're missing because for the majority of them, they just do not pass the test of being legendary and kind of dilute the deck. And Dihada's strength is the ability to also draw the legendaries basically in exchange for 1 mana each time. That being said, we still get to play non-legendary creatures like Priest of the Fell Rites because it goes into the graveyard and has an unearth ability which functions as a reanimation spell, which is a really good answer to the thing I pointed out, that Dihada cannot put your reanimation spells into your hand, with Priest of the Fell Rites saying, well, one of them it can, which I particularly like. I think things like braids stick out to me a little bit. I will say that Dihada does set up a really cool situation where if you play Dihada, if you have braids in hand, specifically has to be in hand, you can then sacrifice, you can mill all 4, sacrifice 3 of the treasures to play braids, and then on your end step, you can sacrifice the last treasure to get draw 3 most of the time that early in the game is really strong, but it is kind of required to have that set up because alternatively, if Dihada flips braids, you put her into your hand, you get 1 last treasure, you stack the 3 treasures, you put braids in. Then you have to kind of decide what you're going to play, what you're going to sacrifice, which could be a land, could be a mana rock, but doesn't have the same kind of power if you had the treasure to sacrifice instead. A lot of the other ones are fine. Mila is strange. I know we're playing her for the. I actually don't know the gender of this fox, but we're playing them for the second ability. Just seems like I don't know. I never see this card, and whenever I see this card, I don't know how impressed I am by it. It doesn't really do much by itself, and then kind of just loses to a board clear. Turn target creature from your graveyard to the battlefield that gains haste. I guess this is why we're playing it. We're playing it more for Luca, which is a weird sentence to say out loud. But Luca's reanimation ability is in red too. Very strange, but very doable. Losing it at the end step is kind of rough, but the idea that you can reanimate and immediately get it back is good. This I think also it's worth saying that I never read Dihada's ultimate. For people who might be newer to the game or play more casually, it might be strange that I don't really pay attention to the last ability of a planeswalker. It's just that it's often seen as not something, it's like flavor text most of the time. You're playing Dihada for her first 2 abilities. Her last ability is really, really hard to get to. 11 is a very high number, and in order to facilitate that, you have to not be using her -3, which is her really strong ability. And so she's at 5. She goes to 7, 9, 11. So about 4 turns where you have 3 opponents who have just decided not to attack Dihada. I guess she defends herself very well with a single legendary creature, but even then, But for the sake of it, I'll read gain control of non-land permanents until end of turn. Untap them, they gain haste. So it is an insurrection that grabs all permanents. Yeah, don't worry about that. That's not why you're playing Dihada. You don't need to think too much about that. Instead, worry about everything else. Okay, so the rest of this is particularly good. I like Neheba's ramp. I like Shanid as a secondary to your commander to pay you off for playing legendaries. This is all good, but I would like to take a second, take a look at our reanimation targets, which ones work and which ones don't. Now, Orlai, I think it's Orlai. Orlai is particularly strong in tandem with other creatures, but I think makes a lot more sense in other Mardu shells, such as with Ishin, where you can get that attack trigger twice. You do get the attack trigger twice, even because it's the first time she attacked, and she gets the trigger twice. Okay, that makes sense here, but I don't see a lot of uh, creatures you have here that really particularly benefit from that extra attack, with the exception of Gisela and Ancient Brass Dragon. So she stands out as a little strange to me. I think she belongs in a different kind of deck. Likewise, Sun Titan also feels like he belongs in a different deck. You don't have like usually aristocrat strategies, sacrifice strategies, egg strategies. These kind of things are where someone like Sun Titan belongs. Like, don't get me wrong, I understand that you're going to play Sun Titan and then reanimate Loran or Loran, I think, um, and destroy an artifact. But that's just kind of okay. I don't think this is where the deck wants to be. Sun Titan is one of those really strong white cards, but this isn't really where he belongs. Ancient Brass Dragon. When it deals combat damage, roll d20, then put any amount of creature cards of total mana value X or less from graveyards onto the battlefield. Ah, I'm having a hard time with this one. Without haste, this is 7 mana to do nothing, and even then, I don't like the chance element. I recognize that you're probably not going to roll a 1, but you're probably going to roll something okay. You'll probably get at least one creature is the dream. The floor is lower than that, but it's all right. I don't like that this creature further leans into the reanimation plan without really adding much to it. Like it itself is an okay reanimation target. It requires a lot of work for it to reanimate. I do like that it reanimates your opponent's creatures as well, but this feels like a lot of hoops to jump through for a random effect. And since it's on combat damage and not attack, just another hoop, this creature might get Swords to Plowshares a lot because you bought your opponents a lot of time to be able to do so. And really, it does work well with Orlai, or Aurelia, sorry. Um, but it's just not enough in my mind. There's like a very real possibility that you play Ancient Brass Dragon and then you attack, and there's just not enough things in the graveyards. You know, if um, if you have someone around that plays something like Author of Shadows, a very underrated card, um, all of a sudden you have almost nothing to bring back from your graveyard, and because they've all been wiped, and you are stuck with a 7/6, which though is strong, is okay. Gisela is fine. I think Gisela in a reanimation deck is pretty good. I don't like to play her fairly, but when you can just play her, like if you could pay 1 mana for Gisela, I think she is really, really strong there. It is really her mana cost that I find too much for her ability, so this is fantastic. Um, I don't know how to pronounce this. Kervek is very, very strong. Feels a little out of place, but much like Gisela, I'm happy at casting this for 1 or 2 mana. Both of these cards are just generically good cards in the colors at high mana costs, as opposed to kind of game-winning threats. So I don't know. I'm gonna call this kind of medium. They're really strong, and you need reanimation targets, but they feel like these two don't even. I guess they do work together because it still doubles Karavek's power, but even then they don't work thematically together because they're rewarding different things. One rewards your opponents and you to be aggressive towards each other, and Karavak rewards your like politics and your opponent. It kind of convinces your opponents not to cast a lot of spells. I don't know. Maybe they can work really well if you can politic them together, but they don't have like a natural, clean kind of synergy. Whereas Piru, once again, feels like it attacks in an incredible, like a completely different way as um, you reanimate it, and then it's a 7/7 lifelink, and then when it dies, it hits each creature that's not legendary for 7, which you gain back as life. It is a very, very big swing, but once again, this is only good if you can reanimate it because he's a lot of mana, and then you need a sack outlet immediately because otherwise you have to wait a whole turn to uh, get Piru out and get to the upkeep, and then decide whether or not you want it to die. And once again, Path to Exile, Swords to Plowshares, these are all cards that interfere with that. So if you had something like if you had a way for you to destroy it yourself, which is I don't generous gift, I guess. Yeah, it's not great. I don't think you can really rely on this as a board clear. I think he's really, really cool, especially in a Legends Matters deck, but not with this theme. You know, like if you were playing Aristocrats with a slight, you know, what I would call Legendaries Matters theme, I think then I would be a lot more inclined to agree because then you can just like Piru is just there to be reanimated and you have a few reanimation cards. But here you're all in on the reanimation plan, and Piru once again feels like it has a lot of ceiling, like a lot of hoops to jump through for an okay-ish ceiling. All right. What do I like? I like Shieldred. I like Villas. Both of these are very good. And you may not be surprised here. I like Elish Norn Grand Cenobite. I think you should definitely playing her in here. I believe she just got reprinted, which brings her down to very nicely under $20. What is there in Multiverse Legends? Is surprisingly expensive. Um, 7. Oh, it's because it's, yeah. Okay. But something like Elish Norn is very, very good, even without having a large group of creatures. Elish Norn's ability to just keep the board wiped for certain decks is so, so strong and absolutely should belong in your reanimation deck. There are games where you will play Elish Norn and you will just win. I was playing against a Kalia the Vast, I believe, deck, who is the 2/2 Angels, Demons, and Dragons deck. And since she's a 2/2, once Elish Norn was reanimated, they could just never play their commander, and the game was over for them. This is very, very strong, and I heavily encourage you playing it. I'm trying to think of anyone else I might be missing. My knowledge. We're gonna go to EDH Rec real quick to see if there is. Oh, EDH.com. EDHRec.com. I I don't like often going here. Let's go themes for just more than general ideas. Because if you build a deck that is, how do I search or find in page? Find in page, Control F. I don't know why it wasn't working. Oh, it's at the bottom. That's why I'm not used to Firefox. Legendary. Okay, so I'm going to really quickly, we're going to see within Mardu if there's anything I didn't particularly see as a reanimation deck or like a reanimation target. Or am I doing this backwards? I might be doing this backwards. I think maybe what we should be doing is going to reanimation. This is hard. Reanimation. Oh, there it is. Reanimator decks. Okay. Go into Mardu. And let's see if we have any really big creatures that we missed out on. Ooh, Breach the Multiverse is definitely a card you could be playing. But that being said, Sister Hospitalier. Return target creature. That's too much. I don't think you're particularly missing anything big. So I will go with what I was thinking before with Archon of Cruelty is a nice kind of uh, safe reanimation target. It also always goes into the graveyard. And then Kroxa and Krunos are very interesting. Let's look at two of these. Let's look at Kroxa and Kunaros, who represents another reanimation each turn, and all you need to do is exile 5 cards from your graveyard, which is very doable with the Dihada's minus. I think that's interesting. I think that's fine. Um, it does another version of what your deck wants to do while being in colors. But I think also to Dread, let's put Mangler and find if it's Dread. It's Dusk Mangler. Dusk Mangler is something I've recommended recently as a reanimation target, and I think I'm going to do it again. Um, I think Dusk Mangler is particularly good, especially when you have repeated methods of reanimation, such as with Kroxa and Kuronos or Shieldred. And I think something like this can give you a lot of advantage. I think one of the problems now, or one of the weaker points of the deck, I should say, is that a lot of the cards that you play don't immediately grant you advantage. Gisela is close to an exception because it is a static ability, and Karavek is also very close because it says, hey, from now on there's a new rule, and even if they try to remove Karavek, you at least get one trigger out of it, which isn't bad. But cards like Shouldret wait for upkeep. Cards like Villas require certain hoops. Villas is really good. I didn't say much about it, but very, very good. And yeah, a lot of these require things to happen, like creatures to attack, ETB cards to be in graveyards. Having something like Dust Mangler that just says each of your opponents lose a bunch of stuff, is really, really clean, really easy to, you never want to put in your hand, and you have a lot of ways to Buried Alive it or other effects. Um, you reanimate this, and you will find yourself pulling ahead really, really quickly. It is not a legend, it is an uncommon creature, but I do think it is particularly strong. It gets better with flicker effects, with ephemerate and the like, but I think it's fine just as an additional reanimation target, especially when you have things like Shieldred to make the most of reanimating it repeatedly. I noticed you had a considering section. I'm going to very quickly look. Achroma, Shaddix, Celestine, Ratadrobic. Shaddix is the closest thing that I can see that I would like you to consider because at least it triggers on combat, which is a very if you do it on main phase 1, you're able to get that trigger early. Outside of that, I don't see anything here that I would particularly put in. I like this deck. I'm going to check how our timing is going. Yeah, this is a good time to be wrapping up. I generally like this deck. I see the direction you've gone into. I think something that's notable is that within your colors, it seems like I'm looking at Plarg right now, but I'm also looking at Invasion. You have a lot of really good discard into the graveyard. You have a lot of Unburial Rights. You have a lot of those effects. And I think that's something you can be a little lighter on. Generally, when our commander gives us access to an ability, we should be, we're less, we need it less, right? And what, and there is a difference, don't get me wrong, there's a difference between what Dihada does and Burial Rights does. My goodness, Buried Alive does, which on that note, I haven't seen if you're playing Buried Alive, Burial Rights. You should be playing this. You are already in the theme of taking advantage of this by throwing it into the graveyard. You should be playing this. You should also be playing Unmarked. Oh no, Unmarked Grave gets done. You could still probably play Unmarked Grave The fact that it can put Priest of the Fell Rites or Unburial Rites into your graveyard, I think is good enough. And you do, if you play like Dusk Mangler, you do have a non-legendary target. Sorry, but coming back to this, I recognize that like faithless looting effects, like looting effects, mill effects, and entomb effects don't do the same thing. And I like that you have a variety, but I do think you could possibly cut down a little bit on the looting, as you have quite a few, and Dihada is mainly going to make up for that because she one will generate mana for you to be able to cast those creatures from hand as opposed to, they're just rotting in there. And two, her mill effect gives you a lot of selection in your mill when it comes to your legendary creatures, so that if you don't, if you're not drawing something into your hand, like it's not every legendary goes into your hand, so you're given the option to actually throw it into your graveyard so you don't have to worry about looting. I wonder, I hope that makes sense. I just think this is a direction that you should be thinking of the cards in here. But other than that, and other than the few changes that I've noted, which I think would improve the deck, I think the deck itself is a really strong idea. I want to see, I want to see how far you can take it. And I'm just going to say this out loud, and I'll leave you to decide whether or not you want to consider it. I think a deck like this can go a bit softer into the reanimation plan. Sorry, my goodness. Softer into the legendary plan, because Dihada doesn't need you to be putting the legendaries into your hands. Like, don't get me wrong, you still want a high amount of legendary creatures for her +2 to be relevant. Um, but once again, that high number could be like half. You could have half your creatures be legendary creatures, and I think it would be fine. The fact that you're going to play Dihada, immediately -3 her, immediately dig for one of your legendary creatures if you wanted one, and make the mana that you with the rest, I think is particularly strong and doesn't require for you to really go all in on the legendary strategy as much as you might feel. Um, if there's anything else I'll say, you could probably get away with playing the other Thalia. I agree that Thalia Heretic Cathar, I think this is like the first thing I said about the deck, and now it's going to be the last thing I comment on. But Thalia Heretic Cathar, I agree, does not particularly fit here and is a clean cut. But part of the reason I said which Thalia at the start is that Thalia Guardian Thraben, if you've seen any of my videos, you know I particularly love her. I think would definitely fit in a deck like this, as long as you get away with casting your commander first. If you don't, then it's not as good, but um, being able to buy time across 4 players, and the fact that you're casting spells like Animate Dead or Reanimate, the 1 extra mana doesn't matter for you as much as it does for your opponents. Just something to think about. If you build a second version of this deck or any other deck you'd like me to take a look at, please remember there is a form in the video description below, and I would absolutely love to see the next version. I think this is a really cool deck. And if you'd like to like, comment, and subscribe, I would be a big fan. This YouTube channel is still getting off the ground, and any support is very much so appreciated. Thank you very much, and good luck with your deck.